Welcome to episode 19. You are trapped in history with me, your host, Robbie Malcolmson. This is a podcast meant to support history teachers, students, as well as anybody who is purely interested in history. This episode, I'm excited about. It also has a very personal attachment for me this time. This episode is entitled A Conversation with Educator Nelson Bodenbender. And Nelson and I have a little bit of a background, but before I get into that, Nelson, I just wanted to welcome you onto the show. Thank you for taking the time out of your very busy life to do this.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me. A long-time listener, first-time guest. Really excited.
The long-time listener from June.
Yeah.
But it's still a baby podcast. I appreciate it, man. And for any of our listeners, I just want them to know too that Nelson and I have a previous connection because I think it was 5 years ago now. Has it already been 5?
I think it's a little over 5.
Yeah. So as I said on an earlier episode about my background, I teach in Southern Kentucky, South Central Kentucky. It's in a county called Logan County, and I've been at that same school for 15 years. And about 5 years ago, Nelson was a student teacher there. So you're still a young man. So you're a student teacher at Logan County, and he taught under I think one of our best teachers that we've had at our school is Adam Webster, and I think he did U.S. history. I don't know if you did any dual credit or AP while you were doing it, but I think you just stuck with U.S., right?
Yeah, it was just a junior level U.S., and it was great. It was fantastic.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that I want to tell the listeners that I noticed is that I only got to observe on you one time, but you and I talked a lot in the hallway in between things. Is I felt like you reminded me a lot of one of my early student teachers. His name was Zach Johnson, and the thing is something that you and Zach have, and then Olivia Bowden, my last one this spring, and she teaches with me now. All three of you have it's kind of a weird comfort. I don't know how you describe this, but some student teachers I've had have been very, very nervous and very wound up, and it took them a long time to kind of really feel comfortable in their skin. And I don't know if there's something experience that you had in the background that you want to share later, but I felt like you already had some experience of talking in front of people because all three of you had this weird kind of comfort level where you're already comfortable in your own skin. You were kind of sarcastic, but joking. You made it really interesting. And that's kind of a hard thing to find whenever you have a student teacher for the first time. Do you recall at all 5 years ago, what did you go through before that made you, I don't know, maybe somewhat more comfortable than what maybe other student teachers are at the beginning?
It's interesting. I mean, one, I'll give the credit to any student teacher. I mean, it is absolutely nerve-wracking to be a college student who is actively learning the material that you're supposed to be teaching, and you're like, I don't even know what to say. I don't know how to act. Things like that in these classes that you're supposed to be teaching. It's I think that myself, I had a few classes that came before my student teaching, and I got to give credit to Western Kentucky University. They have a great education program. That I had spent a few classes already in a classroom setting and teaching courses, and a few more sophomore level world histories, but still it was just that exposure to being in charge of a classroom. So by the time I got to my student teaching, I already had a few years of experience somewhat. It was teaching 1 or 2 lessons a semester, so it wasn't anything crazy. That was definitely the first time fully being in charge. So yeah, it was a really drastic shift, and I got to also say, with Adam Webster, I mean, he did a really gradual intro to me. So we kind of this fade almost, where he would start talking a little bit less, and I'd start talking a little bit more, and we kind of just meet in the middle, and then I just take over. So he kind of helped me ease into it.
Mm-hmm. And that's good that it's a gradual. Some teachers, as you know, have horror stories where they walk in on day one and the mentor teacher just hands them everything and says, good luck. So
one of the other students that was with me had that exact same situation in their class. I was like, man, I feel so bad for you.
Yeah. Yeah, and I heard that too, from my student teacher this last year. She was having a good experience, but she did tell me some of the experiences of some of her friends or classmates were not going so smoothly. And, that's kind of heartbreaking, too, because as you know, there's already a teacher shortage, not in just the state, but the nation. And it's we don't need to be doing things to make new teachers and make it more difficult for them when it already is in that process. So I do hope that if there's any listeners that are considering having a student teacher or do have them, I hope to God that you all like try to mentor them in a meaningful way, just because, we're trying to get them ready for that. And obviously you've been very like successful in your first 5 years here, and it's going very smoothly. Now, Nelson, if you don't mind, I figured, it's our first episode together. I hope that you're able to come on, or willing to come on in the future, to like dive deep into some content, some topics together. But since it is our first episode together for our listeners, to give them a little bit of a background about you and where you're from, where you went to college, your a little bit of your teaching experience and everything, and family. Would you be willing to share some of that with our audience?
Absolutely. Yeah. So again, my name is Nelson Bodenbender. I go by Mr. Bo in my classrooms because you don't want kids butchering names like that. So I'm originally from the city of Louisville, in Kentucky, and I was born and raised here. I am a product of Catholic schools, both grade school and high school. So I have like um, a different perspective than like the public school route typically has. Um, I went to Western Kentucky. I initially actually started as an architecture major because that's really what I thought I wanted to do. But it was an architectural history class that I took where all we did was just look at like ancient Roman and ancient Greek styles of architecture. And I was hooked. I had always like really loved history. And I think at that moment I was like, I just don't see myself doing architecture. I'm like trying to find some other way to get to history that's just not going directly to history. So I was like, I'm gonna change my major. um, it cost me a year. So I had a fifth year in college, but I think it was well worth it. I graduated with 2 degrees and my teaching certification. So I always kind of joke I get like the 2-for-1 special in that extra year. So I was perfectly fine with it. Um, yeah, and I've been teaching since 2021, I believe. And that's I've mostly been teaching the U.S. based history classes. Initially, our school, I teach at Holy Cross High School, also in Louisville. In fact, it's actually the school I went to school at. So it's kind of a cool alumnus feeling that being able to teach in the same classrooms that you had class in. And right now I'm the current PLC lead for the history department, which is kind of a weird feeling just being this early in my teaching career because only about 5 years on my belt. It's still learning a lot of the new things, and now I'm also being looked to for answers for some of these other teachers who are now younger than me, which is kind of a wild concept to even think about. Um, yeah, that's a little bit more on like my teaching side. As far as my family life goes, I have a wife. Her name is Anna. We just got married back in September. We have a dog, and we live in what's called the south end of Louisville, near Iroquois Park. And yeah, I think it's been a great couple of years, but man, it's been a whirlwind with getting married and then all the changes with teaching and stuff. But it's been really fun. It's been a really fun time.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Life doesn't really slow down, does it?
No, it does not. Not at all.
I wish I could tell you it gets slower, but it really doesn't. More
Yeah.
stuff comes up. Hey, I'm curious on something as a follow-up question. You said you started in 2021, and I know like you were kind of right there in the thick of things. So, you're starting right at the tail end of the COVID restrictions.
Mhm.
And I don't know, like, so whenever you first started that first year, did you have to deal with any leftover like of that, any online like teaching or like kind of work? What was it unusual still in 2021?
I'm going to be completely honest with you. I said the wrong year. I actually started in 2020. So
Okay, then
I
so
got
you
hit.
were going through it.
Yeah, I got
Even
hit
better.
square in the face. In fact, that's probably why I try to block that year out of my memory. It was a rough year to say the least. Having only spent about like I think we had like maybe a couple months in the actual classroom because I actually got hired on in January, like so middle of the school year, coming in fresh. I'm like, I don't know which way to look. I don't know which way to think. And then, bam, COVID happened. So a lot of my coworkers were joking with me that like, hey, if you just survive this, you can pretty much survive anything in teaching. So
Yeah.
you should be good. Um, but yeah, so it was tough dealing with COVID. Obviously, we're still dealing with a lot of the fallout of that. I think a lot of
Yeah.
students, especially with our subject being so reading heavy,
Yeah.
um, And I don't want to speak ill of any other like grade levels, because I think we were all dealing with COVID and like distance learning in different ways. But it it did feel like there was just this absence of reading, period. And
Yeah.
reading levels at our school, and I know a lot of schools around us are kind of at an all-time low. I think that also might be just like a national thing too. But it's still really difficult to encourage them to read a little bit more and a little bit deeper, and also a little bit higher level than I think they're used to. Um, that's been the thing I've noticed the most. I think is the reading level. Writing, I think if they're able to express themselves, they can do a decent job. But the reading comprehension, I think, is something that really needs to pop back up again.
Yeah, I feel like that's one of those continuities that I think that we're often all dealing with. I know we've seen that in our county too, and I like how you said it doesn't mean that's indicative of the teachers that are younger because or that are in the lower grade levels. Because I think that in that distance learning and virtual learning, we were doing the best we could. I mean, none of us have been through something like that before.
Absolutely.
I mean, I did a podcast for like at least 2 years leading up to that with like sports stuff. So the only thing that I felt comfortable with was being on a webcam and teaching. I felt okay doing that because I've been kind of like on in front of a webcam before. But as you know, my teaching style is very discussion based and like debate based. But trying to do that on virtual learning was almost impossible. Like students wouldn't have their cameras on; they would just want to type in the chat. It's like they became less social, like
Yeah.
in that even though we were using social media more. But man, what a difficult year for you to start off on. That was, it's an unprecedented experience to go through something like that, and you made it. So I don't know. Looking back, do you feel like these last 4 years have been somewhat easier after going through what you went through that first year? I guess when you're trying to compare that, or is that not really the right way that you would describe that? I'm not sure.
I don't know. I mean, it's a tough question because, truth be told, I do feel that every year that I've taught has been, it's like its own individual year.
Mhm.
I don't know how you feel about it or other teachers do, but, I don't, it almost doesn't feel like I'm building on something. It's just like, what are the new challenges for this year? And like, how am I going to approach them this year? So, I don't think that necessarily been easier or more difficult. It's just been different.
Yeah.
There were some aspects of the distance learning that obviously like we got cut down to what 3 days a week. I don't know how y'all did
Yep.
it in Logan County, but
Yep.
you know I don't know many teachers that are going to complain about only having to teach 3 days a week.
Yeah.
Uh,
That's true.
but
That's true.
same thing goes for the students. Being in class, but like I said, we're dealing with those issues and the lack of that schooling now. But
Yeah.
yeah, I don't know. I think it's just they're so different.
You just reminded me of something. I think that's exactly how I felt in the last 15 years I've taught. When I look back, I mean, I don't know if this makes you feel better or worse, Nelson, because I know you got a while to go on teaching stuff still, but I kind of feel like every year I've been teaching has been like that too. I don't know if there's been a lot of consistency between the years, other than kind of the subjects. Every year really is like it's an entirely different challenge. So there's some things that come a little easier, some things that can be a little bit difficult, depending on the situation that's going on. But I respect your opinion of that. I'm going to go ahead and dive right into kind of our philosophy questions and kind of getting to the root of your experiences. And I hope with our listeners that are teachers or students or anybody, I hope that it kind of gives them a good perspective of your mentality and your philosophy of how you approach. So just so the listeners know too, to reiterate from earlier, I know that you teach some general ed classes, but I know you're an A push teacher, so you teach AP US history. So I do want
Yes.
the audience to know a lot of my questions tonight are going to be geared towards AP US history, towards Nelson, but I'm also fine if it extends into your other classes that you teach too. It doesn't have to just be about AP,
Hmm.
because I don't want the podcast to strictly just be about that all the time. But nonetheless, I'm gonna go ahead and dive into this first one. I figured a great place to start would be just your philosophy and your experience. So I would like to know, like, what initially drew you to teaching, particularly in history. I know you mentioned earlier that you had gone into like an architectural degree and you started looking at that history. And who knows, maybe that's actually part of that window or door that opened. But so basically, what really brought you into particularly history to begin with, and then also over the last 5 years, how has your approach to teaching history changed?
I mean, I think it's a great question because one, it's my favorite question to answer because I always go back to the teacher I had in high school. His name was Dr. Mark Liggy. He was a professor at Bellarmine for a few years, and I don't know if it was like a, getting close to retirement age, but he wanted to drop down to the high school level and teach. But his style was very lecture based. I mean, I guess think of like your quintessential like college professor, and that was his style, and it was so different from what I had compared to my other classes, which are like very activity based and stuff like this. And I just love hearing stories, telling stories, learning stories. So that's been I think the greatest pass that he's given to me is just that storyteller quality. And I still, I mean, again, I know there's kind of a, going more like the lecture route is a little taboo nowadays with like amongst the history teachers. But to me, it's those engaging stories and how you tell the stories that bring this stuff to life, more so than I think even reading some of these passages go. Um, and I think over the years, I started out initially, I guess, more of that storyteller, but now I am trying to refine, like, okay, I can tell the stories, but like, what skills am I looking for? So I feel like I'm trying to, bridge the gap between like the old style and new style of like only skill based and then like only lecture based and just try to meet somewhere in the middle. Yeah, I have a lot to owe to my old high school teacher for that.
Well, I'm sure that mean a lot to him. I would like to follow up and ask you. So, like, so far, how do you feel like that's going? Like balancing the dichotomy between that storytelling and that narrative approach, and like you said earlier, everything today has been driven like pedagogically towards student centered like approaches. And I know you're bringing that up with skills. How do you feel like so far you've done at balancing that? And I don't know if you can judge it by your own evaluation or the way your students have responded to you with feedback.
Well, I'd like to think that it's been working pretty well. Um, most of the feedback I've had from whether it's be observations from our principal, also be pretty positive. But what's really I guess concrete as opinion in my own head is that my AP scores for like my students continue to be the best in the school, and that's not me trying to brag at all because I really am not like someone who likes to brag. But especially with like the history classes, we've been averaging probably about like a 63 to 65% pass rate for our A push exam. And I granted it's still 63%. We'd always like to be better, but to me, that's kind of like the proof that like okay, so this storyteller, you know, um, format I have can still be applied to like the AP stuff. I can get kids to pass this class and also learn something along the way. Um, and I think it's always interesting. I know it's different for every school, but our school, Holy Cross, is so small. We're average about like 250, 260 students right now. Um, so there's not a lot of variability in their class schedule. So if you're an AP student, you're an AP everything. Um, so I have a lot of students who, history is not their favorite subject, and or they're just more like mathematically or scientifically, minded that this is just not their wheelhouse, and I can still get them to, you know, connect with me, connect with the class, and still actually pass the exam. So I don't know. That was a little bit of a long-winded answer there, but I think I feel like I feel pretty successful in my style.
Yes, I think that was great, and it makes me feel better too because I know over the last 5 years I have the same kind of experience where it seems like our sophomores that have me in AP Euro, the only other AP class that they can take is AP Biology, and
Hmm.
there's always at least two or three that will be taking it at the same time. But I've definitely had at least probably out of the 25 or 30 I've had the last couple of years, there's probably a good four or five, and it tend to be mostly female students that they're very good math and science students and they work really hard. Their work ethic is great, but like history and like narrative, understanding things in a narrative and that kind of thing, it doesn't come to them as easy
No.
as maybe others. But it's like you said, it made me feel better too. Is like whenever some of those pass, though, you feel even better because you have those kids that like, they tell you in the trainings you're going to have the kid that's going to pass no matter what. They could have you or not have you in class, and they're going to probably pass the AP exam as long as you can tell them the format and what they need to hit on the rubrics. and everything. But it's really rewarding when you see that kid fight their butt off and get a 3 or a 4.
Absolutely.
And that was not easy to them at all. It's pretty cool to see that. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask you one more follow-up on the narrative thing.
Yeah.
Short question. And so if you don't understand what I'm asking, just follow up. I would like to know, like, in a culture that's like pushing hard for student-centered learning and a lot of independent learning, and I feel like the narrative is going to where we are more the facilitator rather than the teacher. I would like to know from your point of view, because Adam Webster and I have talked a lot about this in the past, because both of us value storytelling. I think he's truly one of the best storytelling teachers I have ever been around before. He's much more effective than I am at that. I would love to know, like, what do you think is the merit of still sticking to like a storytelling based way of instruction?
Well, I think first, and my thought initially goes to, okay, I am the one who has been to college, and this is, again, sounds like I'm trying to like brag or something like that, but it's really not. It's more like I know what I know, and I'm trying to pass this on to my students. Like, I have multiple degrees, over the content that I've studied. Like, I am a professional in this field, and I know the material extremely well. So to me, it's like I love the fact that I can share this with them. Now, I definitely don't agree with the like sit and get kind of material where like you just write down what I say and only that, because that's not the case. Like, we're not all knowing, but I think, again, what I was talking about earlier, I think it's more engaging when students hear those stories, because that allows, for your excitement levels to come into the classroom. And like, if you're excited about the material and you get the students excited about the material, they're more likely to go to those skill-based assignments or, develop, those skills again, just to further engage them. I just think that, it can't be all one way or the other. I think it has to be somewhere in the middle, because otherwise, if it's all skill based and that's all they do, I mean, I think that's kind of what we try to do with the ACT and other standardized tests. And I just don't think that it doesn't ring home, with the students. I think it feels very mechanical, and I don't think the students respond to it very well. So if we want student buy-in, we have to do something like that.
Nelson, a good segue from the student buy-in part. I think I know where you stand on this. I guess, how much do you prioritize relationships with your students?
Probably, if not the first thing, probably the second thing on my list. Because if you don't have that connection or that relationship with the students, then you're not going to get to them no matter what you're talking about. I mean, you could be talking about how to earn $1 million tomorrow, and you won't have any of them paying attention. So, I used to coach baseball at the school I'm at right now. And so that was always a really cool way to connect with them in and outside the class. And I operate, it's still a relatively new club called the Shop Club, where it's kind of like your old timey like shop class, but it's just an after school thing. So I really love getting to know the students, being a part of the community, because again, our community is so small, but it makes you that much more valuable to that community to be there and be present. So,
You bring up a good point, man. I can't even recall I think people take those shop classes things like for granted.
yeah,
Have you ever read the book of I think it's, what is it, the shop class for Soulcraft or something like that? I can't remember the name of the author. I'll have to show it to you whenever we get off the recording here in a little bit. That's a great philosophy book on basically why that hands-on learning and those classes had like philosophical value. So I think it's technically a philosophy book, but it's like a self-improvement kind of book too. But I
okay,
think it's really popular. Also, our English department at school, we actually have a class set of those. So I know that at one point they were like reading those in class, that book, because it's supposed to be geared towards teenagers. And it's kind of like, I don't know if have you ever listened to Mike Rowe before, like the Dirty Jobs guy? Yeah, but like
absolutely.
his philosophy, I think I really empathize with that. I feel kind of embarrassed because I love getting students ready for college if they really want to go there. Like,
Yeah,
I feel like if they want to go there, you and I, it's our responsibility to help them get ready for that. However, over the last 15 years, I've strongly changed from the you have to go to college teacher to more of do something that you really enjoy, that basically is going to be more economically viable. When it's more of, if you want to go to trade school, that is just as good, and in some cases maybe even better than a 4-year degree. And I know four-year colleges would probably hate me for saying something like that. But I mean, I have students that are getting out of high school with certifications already, or less than 3 or 6 months of training, and they're already making as much as I am, or not more, as an 18 or 20-year-old. And I'm 40 and I have a master's degree.
Yeah.
And it's nothing to say against my school or anything like that on pay, but it just shows you that I was in that generation of the early 2000s, the No Child Left Behind group. And I remember everything was about college. Everybody, it was just all you had to go college, like 4-year kind of thing. And looking back, as much as I love teaching, I wish I would have taken the trade thing a lot more seriously. And I think, but I love that you said that provides more of, I don't know, like a symmetry and like more like connection there with your community. Because I remember I grew up in a tiny, tiny little community in Indiana called Cannleton. And you're the favorite teacher of the school. He's like almost like a god, like to the kids. If you have a teacher that's well respected, they're like family. I mean, and they mean a lot to your community. I have to admit, I kind of miss that, and but I also have to take some blame on that too. Like Jared Frederick said in my last interview. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to that one yet. I know you were trying to get there, but he was basically kind of encouraging people like me and you need to get out of the classroom more, like you're doing right now. Get involved in your community, do history things there. Let the kids see you doing that, and hell, even take the kids with you to do those things in your community. So, I feel like at least you're trying to do that. You're trying to like bridge yourself and make yourself more available than just in the classroom. And I respect the fact that you have that approach.
Well, I think it's really easy for a lot of teachers, but it kind of be like the wizard in the tower. Like I'm here in my room with all the knowledge and all the stuff like that. But I think it's really important to get out. And one of the things I used to do over the summers, as another source of income is always important to teachers. I used to be a museum docent at the Louisville Slugger Museum. Because again, that connection with me being a baseball coach, and then again talking about the history of baseball. I mean, it was like the perfect job, and I always offered up like some extra credit or some extra love in the school year if I see students come in and see me. And I'm also a huge proponent of field trips. That was something I felt like really died away with the COVID years, and then like all of a sudden everyone just stopped taking field trips. And I think those are the memories that stick with you when you actually get to go somewhere and see this stuff instead of just on a screen, in a book, something like that, being able to, walk through it. And still to this day, probably my favorite field trip that's actually like school aligned, because I had the trip to Ireland and England this past summer for like a big school trip. But my favorite trip that I did with a class has been to Fort Boonesborough when I was teaching a Kentucky history class. And, it's one thing like leading up that week to talk about, the stories of like what happens there, like what are the settlers in that fort feeling, like what conflict was going on around them. And then to actually have the students go like to the area, even though it is a reproduction, it's still a really nice reproduction of what these forts actually looked like. It gives a lot more gravity to what we do in the classroom.
You're right. And I think that's one of those areas that I've failed in the last 15 years, is that I've never been quite comfortable. I think just because of my own anxiety of like behavior and like managing that I've let that kind of stand in the way of like being able to take them. And I think that's something in my last 15 years of teaching, I would like to start to like improve that, because I agree with you. I mean, it's hard to replace an experience with just like abstract knowledge from me and you talking to them, to go and see that will stick with them more. There's something about that more. So I need to use that. I have to admit though, I teach world history and Euro history. So I have a hard time. I have a hard time in my area where I live at, like where can I go? And I know that there are connections and there's things that you could do, but definitely if I was teaching US again, I would definitely be able to use that. But I think that there's also those opportunities there. It's more of just being able to go find them is what I'm going to hit on. Now, so if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and kind of push a little bit deeper dive into the the AP US stuff. I would like to know what challenges have you encountered while teaching AP US history, and how have you adapted your teaching strategies to overcome them?
I mean, I think I'm going to go with probably the easiest challenge for AP stuff is just that how do you balance content coverage with like more of the AP style of questions, the skill focus, like where is the middle ground? Like what is a good amount of this and a good amount of that? I mean, that's a question I'm still trying to find the answer to this day. Um, you know, I I like to lean more on the content side because I'm a firm believer of, you can have these skills, but like if you don't know what to do with these skills, you don't know how to apply the skills, then you're still kind of missing that part. So again, even also with with my storyteller kind of style, I want to have um, I want to have that usage of skills. Um, but I think over the years, I've tried to stick closer and closer to what College Board and like the AP, like AP Central, actual like organization tries to tell teachers to do, because I mean they're telling you exactly what they're going to do on these exams, and it's your job to get them ready. So trying to find that balance of like how much can I go into content and like have more of those fun and engaging classes while also getting the business done. And I don't. I think it's the same situation with yours or not. It may not be. Again, with our situation being a small school, our students, when I get them as juniors, I have AP juniors for US, and this is the first history class that they have had since they were in seventh or eighth grade. Most of the time, seventh grade. So even if they did allegedly have U.S. history in grade school, and again, a lot of these kids are, the children of the COVID years, so they don't even really know a lot of the basics of U.S. history. So I feel like I have to do it justice. I have to go back and revisit this stuff just so we even know what we're talking about.
That's something that Adam and Webster and I had talked about. I think him and Carson Zybert that teach US at our school now, they will do that too. Because they're supposed to start the year, as you know, in Kentucky and US history, you're supposed to start it after Reconstruction. But
There's no
it's like
way.
it's like how do you do that when you haven't had it since eighth grade? You feel like you kind of at least have to do a contextualization unit to go over the foundation, antebellum, like the Civil War to an extent, to kind of see how did it even get to this point. Because like you said, it's like you're trying to get to this point in the middle of American history, but it's like you leave out all this other context that made this other stuff possible. And
Mhm.
but it's like you said though, there's a dichotomy there and a balance of, I only have so much time. If you're like me, I plan everything down to the day. Like I try to give myself at least 2 or 3 weeks of review time at the end of the year after spring break's over. So I try to get done with the 9 units as early as I can, but giving them justice. And I feel like over the last 5 years, I'm constantly fighting that. I'm constantly trying to find the balance on that. And I know you hit on this a little bit earlier. I think this is a good kind of way to wrap out that point here. Is I guess considering the breadth of the content in AP US history, how do you balance the need for that depth, but also critical analysis? So, for example, one of the best pieces of advice I got in my first year getting trained at APSI was the professor or the teacher that I had. He would always say this phrase: "A document a day makes the DBQ okay." And he
Yeah.
says kind of a cheesy thing. So in my head, I'm like, okay, I would love to do a narrative storyline thing where every day I have some kind of interesting story, but then there's always some document, a visual, an audio thing, a written thing that I have to complement that. And I feel like sometimes if I don't have something physical to complement like what I'm narrating or storytelling, I feel like am I really getting them ready for the critical analysis part of that? So for me, that's always been my constant battle. And I feel like over the last 5 years, I'm getting better at having more lessons that are like that. How have you balanced that? Like, what's your approach to balancing the need for critical analysis, like use of those skills, but you're also aware that I have this big breadth of knowledge and content that I have to cover?
Well, I think I inherited that document a day thing from you and Webster, because that's something that I use on a daily basis. Like we're always looking at something just so we have that repetition. Um, I think specifically with the style of questions, I want it to be like a reflex, because as you know, and as anybody who has really looked into like AP style of questions, like you start to notice that there's like a rhythm and a pattern to a lot of these questions. So in my mind, okay, if I can, you know, give my students as many examples as possible and they get used to that style and they develop that like longevity for like the entire, course, then I mean, we're getting in the right direction. I think you can kind of start to push content a little bit to the back burner when you can get to that repetition. I think also One thing I do, and again, I don't know if this is good thing, bad thing. It's just what I've been doing, and I've had decent success with it. Is I kind of pick and choose my units, and like I almost change my style based on the unit that I'm covering. So, for like example, Unit 3 for A Push is founding, the founding of the United States, the American Revolution, even the building of the Constitution, things that I think the students are more familiar with than some of the more kind of back burner topics. I want to call them back burner because it's just less talked about, I think. So during Unit 3, which by that point you should be around October ish in the school year. So like you've had experience with them, they're used to your style a little bit. We focus more in already introducing I call them mini DBQs, where I give them like 3 documents to really analyze, and we give like 2 whole class periods. Like first one is just picking apart the sources, like every sentence, every line, everything you can possibly get out of them. And then the next day we go into like, okay, how do we use the evidence that we found, the points that we found? Again, I don't know if it seems like it's been successful. So I've had, pretty decent success. I think also, it's always a gamble of trying to figure out which topics you're going to get brought up more on the exam. I think it might have been an episode of yours a few back that you were talking about, like every year you like almost have like a lottery or something like that. You're all
we try to predict what it is.
Gosh, I mean, they don't make it easy on us. So yeah, I just try to balance my styles based off of the units, and then I'll within those certain units, I just go more into skill focus.
Yeah. Well, it's also like you said, they're ultimately in the end, none of us, including the students, don't know what they're going to be asking for sure on the test. But if they have that skill background, that they theoretically should be able to handle it, like whatever they're getting. We had a joke this year because I predicted that feminism would be one of the topics for the DBQ this last year, because it had been a long time of a social issue, something from around that time era. So the kids showed up, several days later after the test, they came in like laughing and joking that as soon as they saw like first wave feminism, they're like, yep, he called it. So they were ready with that suffrage and educational opportunity and all that stuff. So they had all those references kind of ready, that evidence beyond the documents. They had that kind of stuff ready in their head of what they wanted to use and all that. And in some years I don't get lucky at all. Like some years I predict, it's going to be a second semester topic. It's been 3 years. Then they do another first semester topic, and I'm like, oh man. But hey, you do something that's very, very similar to me, almost the same as I feel like usually right before fall break, though, with Unit 2, after they have the context of Unit 1, I'll do that mini DBQ the first time. And like you said, I'll try to focus on getting that content done. And then we'll spend 2 or 3 days on just a DBQ together, like you had said earlier. But that's where I think it's the perfect time to go. Now, remember, every day we've been practicing point of view, intended audience, bias, purpose, all these kind of things. And I'll show them the rubric again. I go, no, listen, we read this document here about removing serfdom, but look at the point of view. The guy's a king. So this isn't just some basic peasant saying we should get rid of serfdom. Why does his point of view matter? And that's where the kids are like, boom. Like they'll be like, wait, this guy's a king. He has absolute power. He affects the laws and whatnot. This is a huge deal. Like for someone like him in his position to say that. So that's when I tell the students that I've been kind of using this strategy the last couple of years, where think of whenever you're using a doc like a mathematical formula. And for the math students, it really helps them on there. It's like you're trying to paraphrase what that person is basically saying, but some students just leave it there and they may move on to the next doc. And I always say the very next sentence, then say like, as the king of this country, comma, they feel this way because of that. That's that point of view thing that's on there, right? Or the purpose of this document was to do this. The intended audience was to do that. So I kind of get them this repetition. I don't know if this makes sense to you. It's easier to see.
No, it makes perfect sense.
But basically, I tell them, think of it like I have to be able to paraphrase, like what's the point they're making and how is it relevant to the question? More importantly, see how that's relevant to the question.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if US does this. I think you do. The last 4 years, we've always had like an either or question on the DBQs. So it's is it more religious or is it more political? Yeah. And you're looking for that. So I always tell them, make sure you answer that question with every time you use a doc, at least like paraphrase that in there, but then add that little caveat, that little thing about that point of view, that purpose, that intended audience, that goes really well. And you're right. I feel like after modeling that the whole year, eventually they get to the point where they kind of do it like second nature. Like some of them struggle the whole year, but then some can get it really easily, and it just becomes a normal thing. Another thing I'll recommend, Nelson, is the first time that we'll do that, we'll do a Socratic seminar with it. We'll do it. We'll annotate it. We'll mark it up to look for that. And then we discuss it openly in a circle. So the kids are sharing what they found. And then they can like learn from each other that, hey, their point of view matters because of this. And they have those aha moments. I feel like that's helped a little bit. Thank you for.
Oh, I'm sorry, cut you off. I would say my favorite thing to do, not so much on the like written passages or the stimulus, is looking at the visuals, because as
love it.
Like getting students to pick apart things. I have an activity where I have them break down political cartoons for World War I, and every student sees something different in that picture. And that's also a great time. It's like, hey, this is how perspective works. This is, how people even develop bias if they go further with it. So I've had a lot more success with the visual images. Obviously, because I think looking at pictures is a little bit easier than having to digest 19th century vocabulary and format. So yeah.
Well, I tell the kids too, me personally, I've always been a visual learner. So I think I'm also been partial to that. As I told you, I finished up the Renaissance. I'm finishing up the Age of Exploration this week, and Unit 1 will be done for AP. But I've been very heavily visual. Like every day I'm showing some kind of visuals that we're breaking down and talking about. And especially as in the Renaissance, there's lots of examples that you can use to get those themes that you have to know for humanism and whatnot on there. So I love doing that. And I have to encourage any new teacher listening, if you can use visuals, a lot of students really relate to that. Now, I've had my fair share of students, Nelson, that have told me, hey, the visuals, as much as I like them, I don't really connect with them. But for me, I'm much better with a paragraph. Like if I see a paragraph or something, boom, I got it. I can break that down. It's very interesting to see how different learning styles are. And some of them are just good with auditory. They're good with hearing you talk about it and going back and forth with you out loud. And for some of them, that's good. That's enough what they need for them to understand it. Now, I figured let's kind of go into this. One more last question about the content for this one for you is what strategies have you used to keep students engaged with difficult or more maybe less exciting periods of history? Because you kind of said that earlier, and I know you don't mean back burner as that they're not important, right? But I'm assuming that those might be some of those ones that might be a little bit hard to hook them in with that interest level. How do you cope with that as you're going forward?
I think you're right. There are those topics Cross of Gold speech, where it's kids are like, what are you even talking about? Talking about the gold standard, silver standard. It's not that it's not important. It's not that it's not exciting. It's just something that, again, we're dealing with high schoolers here. The high schoolers are interested in the wars, the blood and guts, the really tumultuous times where people are struggling, then great, stories of triumph. So I think that I always try to connect it to something personal, whether that's their own family history. Because I know one of the units that's always brought up is Unit 6 for AP US History, which is primarily looking around the Gilded Age, Reconstruction period as well. That, it's right after this, great clash in the Civil War, and it kind of feels like things are heading downhill. We're kind of spiraling a little bit, but then we're also picking ourselves back up. So it's kind of a, time of a lot of uncertainty. So, I also talk about, during this time period, especially, that there's a lot of immigrants coming to the United States. And, that's where I start to go into the more of that personal connection. I think a lot of teachers do it, but they have the family tree exercise. But then I have them go a little step further, and I have them pick a specific family member that they may know, or that's just somewhere, in their family tree, and see what events that they lived through. So whether it was, Spanish American War, World War I, or just things like that. So just trying to find something that is specific to the kids in those units. And then again, also not even just if it's not specific to the students, like I just said earlier, the kids are always interested in stuff that's kind of gross or gruesome.
Yeah.
So we start going into like conversations on labor, and it's a little early for like Upton Sinclair in the Jungle, but when you start talking about like child labor laws during that time, it's like, hey, people would love to be in school during this time period. Like you were incredibly lucky to be in this position. Otherwise, half of you would be in a coal mine or something like
Yeah.
that, or working on the railroad. So, be thankful. So just little things like that, just to keep their attention, because I think, especially right around Unit 6, like you're kind of midpoint of the course, so pressure's still off, exams kind of far away. So it's just kind of like the doldrums a little bit.
Yeah, yeah, I understand. Well, I like how your theme is to make it personal for them. Now, in the point of view of a new teacher that's very paranoid about time, I'm kind of curious, how much class time do you spend on that personal family tree thing? Is that more of a thing that the students do independently, or
It's
do
an
you actually
independent.
devote class time?
No, it's more of like an independent project, because they're gonna have
Okay.
to spend time outside of class researching this stuff and talking with their family members. And then I didn't mention it before, but specifically if there's like a student who may not know their own family history, or could potentially even be like adopted, I allow them to like look at a specific individual from history. And like follow their story, like how they were, born and raised, where they were brought up, and like what influenced, their decision making, and how we got to know them as a historical figure. So, but yeah, I mean, this is something that's going on in the back burner. It's also a low stress assignment for me. It's something
Mhm.
that's not AP aligned. It has nothing to do with that. So this almost kind of feels like sacrilegious to not dedicate every every hour of
Yeah.
every day to the AP style. But again, I think especially at this point of the school year, when you get to Unit 6, I think the students need a break. They kind of need a little bit of a breather. So
Yeah.
um, yeah,
Yeah, and like for us, is Unit 6 for you? Is that the first unit you do after Christmas break?
yeah, yeah, because it's
Yeah,
always
same here.
the
Yeah.
make sure Lincoln's dead by Christmas.
Yeah, and ours is
As long as
Napoleon. Make sure Napoleon's dead by Christmas.
somebody's going to be dead by Christmas. Yeah,
Yeah, that's a good way to look at it. Somebody always has to die right before Christmas.
yeah.
Okay, so Nelson, I had a couple of questions planned for advice for new teachers. The last time that you and I spoke a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the country competition project, about doing that. That's going to be an episode, a couple of episodes I'm going to have later on, breaking down what that project is. So I can always grow that a little bit for listeners. I can go into what that actually is. But I won't forget that you kind of brought up something to me at one point. You kind of had something you said in off passing that you said, I wish I would have known that when I first started. So I thought I definitely wanted a section of questions tonight where I asked you, if we go back to Nelson, your first year of teaching AP US history, because there's going to be some listeners here that's teaching AP World or AP US or Euro, or even maybe human geography for their first ever year. So I'd love to know for you, maybe not necessarily a singular most important, but maybe if you have any amount of advice to give, what do you wish that you would have received your first year of teaching? What do you wish you knew?
I think, and it's not so much as like it's not going to any like industry secret or like a tip or like this is going to save you so much
Yeah.
time and effort, but it's just like little things to remind yourself as you're going throughout your first school year. Is that I think the first one is don't let them see your sweat, because
No.
if the students can pick up that you're a little frazzled. I know
Mhm.
it's so difficult that first year to not be a little frazzled, but be like the wizard in Wizard of Oz, like behind the curtain, like all that's going on back there, but like they don't see that. Um, I think especially that first year, I had to do a lot of like brushing up on specific topics that even in college, like we didn't ever talk about. So it was it's a tough first year, because like I think that thought of, oh, I have no idea what's going on, almost like you kind of feel that building up inside, like that imposter syndrome of like, maybe I shouldn't even be doing this, like who am
Yeah.
I to be teaching these students. So yeah, I think that don't let them see you sweat, and then also that you do know more than you think you know. Like I think a lot of people kind of fall into that same category of like, I just don't know what I'm doing. I shouldn't be here. And I just think that is a it's something to get away from. Like trust in
Mhm.
yourself. If you you have these degrees for a reason, They don't hand those
Yeah.
out just for anybody just for showing up. Like you earned those things, so know your worth. So
Yeah, and your school picked you to teach AP for a reason. That means that
yeah,
they have the confidence in you. You can hold it. I have to admit, imposter syndrome is the perfect way to put it because that first summer after I went home, the first day of training, I've been teaching for 10 years. I thought I knew a lot of what I was doing, but I remember telling my ex-wife now, but I remember telling her at the time, like, I don't know anything.
yeah,
I feel like the way I was teaching before wasn't nearly as effective as what I just learned today. Like in just one day of AP training, I kind of left thinking, "Oh my God, I got to know so much now," and like I felt like I didn't really deserve it. And some of the best advice, I don't know if you felt like this. Larry Treadwell trained me my first year, and in the AP Euro world, he's very well known and respected within that group. And I think I was one of the last groups that he had trained, but he had told me personally that give it to your third year and then you're going to notice you're going to start feeling a lot more confident in yourself. He's like, you're
absolutely.
not going to get every lesson perfectly. He said, but try to make 2 or 3 really good lessons meaningful this year. Hopefully they work really well. But he said, like every year you keep going, you keep building that repertoire up as you're going, and your confidence will go. And that's the thing. There's like I had to brush up a lot, but I did know more than I thought I did.
Hmm.
So it was interesting. I think your advice is extremely valuable.
Well, and I think also like even if like you don't know the information, you know how to study and how to get prepared to know the information. Like you are right around like the college, range. Like you were just in school, or maybe if you're coming out of like like retirement, or you're just picking back up in school, like you know how to study and how to prepare for this stuff. Even if you're just passing on those skills to the students, I think that's really important. And this is something that was even told to me by my former PLC lead for like my first year doing a push. He's like, "Listen, man, uh, the expectations are kind of low if we're being honest. It's the first year for you teaching this class. Like it's gonna be a drastically different style. Like don't worry about the results of the students on the exam. Just worry about teaching them the material, doing what's absolutely within your power to do. Just do it. Still have fun with it, because I think like a lot of times, especially with when we get into like AP style of like courses, that it's so exam heavy and like
Yeah.
statistic bound that it's like you're kind of losing sight of like why you're teaching in the first place.
Yeah.
You know, so
That's a good point. Now, from your first year to your fifth year of teaching AP, have you noticed that you've been able to have more fun?
oh, absolutely,
Yeah, me
absolutely.
too.
And I'm not stressing every night trying to like prep my lessons. Like, and that's also I think another thing too that over the course of time, like you're gonna build quite a nice little nest egg of like resources and material that
Yeah,
you can just rely on. Like even if you don't feel like teaching what you had planned, and just kind of dip into that file real quick, find something that still connects. Um, and that was also a concern I guess I had starting out. It's just that I don't have materials.
yep,
What am I going to do? And so I'd be up till midnight almost every night, planning and prepping, typing away, and it was miserable. It was miserable.
yep. Well, I mean, and I definitely remember those feelings for sure. Um, I wanted to bring up this from last week, the listeners. So I had a female friend of mine. It's a teacher. She started to teach APUS this year, and she had emailed me and asked me if I knew anybody that had resources for APUS. And luckily, I was able to. I thought of you, and immediately I thought of you. So I don't know if you remember, like last week, I emailed you and I tagged her. I
Right.
put CC'd her an email. I was like, "Hey, could you help my friend out here? Like, she's teaching this class." And I want to know from you because I have to admit, over the last 2 years, that's been one of the most fun things I've experienced in the summer. Because I do the AP trainings, if not every summer, then every other summer. And I've always learned some new things in there, but it never fails. Like I'll start talking to 7 or 8 brand new teachers, and then they'll,
Mhm.
they'll they'll ask me for stuff, and it's a really cool feeling to know that I share my drive with them. Here's all this stuff that I worried so much about making, but now I can help them. Hopefully, not be as scared as I was like not really inheriting much. So I want to ask you, like, how's it felt for you? Have you been able to help other people out as well? Was that the first time you did that last week before, or have you actually been able to do that in the past couple of years, where you've actually been able to share a lot of your stuff with other new history teachers in US?
Yeah. So I think in the more recent years, for sure, that's become more of a kind of like that summer staple for me. But because like, I'm still just building up my own supply of like sources and materials. But yeah, I think that is part of like the fun. It almost feels like kids on a playground, like doing like the like trading cards kind of deal. It's like, oh, I've got units 5 through 6 on certain like DBQ assignments. So it's like, what do you got? And you're just gonna exchange, and it creates community.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
I
great.
think it's an awesome time. But I think that's also part of our job as fellow teachers, because I almost look at it
Mhm.
as like every
Yeah.
teacher, wherever you are, whether your state or your country, like we're all coworkers in this
Yeah.
case. Like
We
we're
are.
all working towards like the same common goal. So it's anything that we can do to help the students, any of our students, all students,
Hmm.
should be our responsibility. It's your responsibility
Yeah.
to help out these other teachers who also,
Yeah.
I think, exactly how they felt. Like they're stressed out of their mind. So anything you can do to help, it really means a lot. So
That's a great point, and I completely agree with you. I think it's important that we never forget what it was like to be new again.
yeah,
It's kind of like as a teacher, I don't think that we should ever forget what it was like to be a teenager. Like some of the things that we kind of laugh at ourselves on some of the things that the teenagers get stressed about, but we forget a lot of us had the same insecurities and existential crises whenever we were young, and we can't forget that. I mean, hell, me and you are over here teaching intended audience, but we ourselves have to consider who our intended audience is. Like every day that me and you teach, we have to remind ourselves we're teaching teenagers here. I'm going to be teaching this thing about economics that's not extremely exciting as a topic, but I have to make it personal to them and all that kind of stuff. I thought that was great, and I
yeah,
completely agree. One of the last things for advice for teachers, because I feel like you're like this too. I know the exam is important. None of us want to make our class just all about the exam, but I know when you're first starting to teach, it does almost feel like that because you're worried. My worst fear is they're going to get the exam later and feel like I did not get them ready. Like
yeah,
my worst fear was a kid's going to come to me and feel like we didn't learn any of that. You didn't teach us well enough. So I was so worried about that my first couple of years of doing that. So I guess my last question for advice on teachers is, what should new teachers do to manage that pressure of preparing students for this rigorous exam at the end, but also at the same time, they're trying to make class enjoyable and meaningful. And I know in your first year of teaching, I don't know if at least I wasn't. I don't know if you're really thinking about making it enjoyable. Like
yeah.
I wanted it to be, but I don't think I was thinking consciously about that. I think I was so worried about getting it all the content done and the skills. I don't know if I truly made it fun for that kind of thing or enjoyable. So, what advice do you have for the teachers that are feeling that pressure, or at least the ones that are going to feel that pressure?
Yeah, I completely know what you're talking about. It almost feels like you're Frankenstein's monster, and like the students are going to show up with like the pitchforks and the torches, like you failed us or something like that.
Yeah.
I definitely think, kind of what I said earlier. Don't take the students' results so personal. The first year I really did, even though like I knew going into it, I was like, I shouldn't do this. Like I gave it my all, not really knowing the full scope of this class. It's hard not to, because it almost looks like it's
Mhm.
a direct reflection on like what you did to prepare them. But it's kind of the second point I think that makes it better is that you know these students, like they're juniors in high school, and this is kind of where like my bridge, like I'm kind of approaching it from more of like the tough love side of things, because yeah, I believe like I'm preparing you for college. So what are you going to do when you're on your own? Is that part of this is student accountability. How much work are
Yep.
they putting into this? Because I tell my students all the time, like if this is the one hour, which we really only have 55-minute class periods, if this
Mhm.
is the only time like a day that you're going over this material and like we're actually working on this stuff, yeah, by the end of this, it's really going to be like an uphill climb to pass this exam. So it's like, how much work are you putting into passing? What are you doing to do this? Like,
Yeah.
I
That's
always tell
true.
my students, like, listen, I've got all the resources in the world. I have like 3 or 4 textbooks that I'm constantly referencing. If you need resources, I've got resources.
Yeah.
Like I've
Yep.
got my plan and I'm sticking towards it. Make sure that we're staying on pass or on pace in our class. But if you need more materials, prep, by all means, come ask, because I've got
Yep.
plenty of it. And I know that that's also kind of like uh, there are, especially with like a private school like us, there's a lot of like the parent kind of interaction there. Like, well, what's your job
Hmm. Yeah.
to prepare my student, not my student to come home and be working their butts off kind of deal. Um, so it kind of goes back and forth. But yeah, I
Yeah.
definitely don't neglect the student accountability part of this too.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point too, because especially as a new teacher, don't forget this is not just on you.
Yeah.
I like what you said there. As long as you give them the opportunity, like give them plenty of choices, keep trying to find ways. Like for example, like I have the podcast links on my classroom now that I'm covering. That's new this year. I've always had the Steve Heimler videos. I think that those are fantastic. They're 8 to 10
I love
minutes
the
long.
Herman videos.
Love them. I put those up there. So I tell the students, if you're like a visual guy, if my Kermit the Frog voice doesn't like resonate with you, but for the love of the flying spaghetti monster, like use this guy, use something. And I've kind of reiterated the same thing. I think I could do better with that. Is that if you're only getting with the 40 minutes that you're with me every day, that's not really going to be enough unless you're just like a history whiz. But more than likely, if you're a history whiz, you're already doing history on your own
Yep.
for fun. Um, but that's a really good point to bring up, and I appreciate your advice for younger teachers because I really wish I would have heard that from people like you whenever I was first starting. And it's crazy because even though I had been teaching for a decade, I don't know about you, but like, oh yeah, you can't empathize with this because you started it right away when you got into it. But I've been teaching for 10 years, and then I started doing AP. I felt like a new teacher all over again. I felt scared and nervous and insecure, and it felt weird to have that feeling again. Whenever I finally hit like this comfort zone as a teacher, I realized, man, I'm not teaching history as effectively as I thought I was, like in
Yeah.
previously. So I was hitting that. Now, I think it's also, it gives us humility, and I think it helps other teachers around the country. A couple of questions that I plan on asking every person I interview is like a section on trials and tribulations. I think we've all gone through heartbreaking moments and moments where we drive home extremely frustrated, or days where we feel like we're on top of the world, like everything is like a storybook kind of thing going. I would love to know if you're comfortable with it. What have been some of the biggest trials or obstacles that you've faced just as an educator in general? This does not have to be an AP thing, but
Mm-hmm.
are there any stories that, because you're really into storytelling, and I think it means a lot
Love
to you.
stories.
What's maybe do you have a go-to story? Because like Adam Webster, as you know, has this. Like he has like two or three stories about from his personal life that he'll share with the students that really resonates with them, and it really inspires them for the future and all that kind of stuff. Is there, I guess, in a way here, I'm asking you, are you willing to share any kind of stories with other teachers of what you've gone through, obstacles or challenges or hardship that you've gone through, that you might be willing to share that might like illuminate a little bit on and get people to empathize what you've gone through?
Yeah. I think at least my first thought when I heard this question was that like something you have to deal with as like a teacher,
Yeah.
and this is something. It's not like a specific individual event because I think like any teacher knows the response. Dealing with the profession that we have. Anytime you tell somebody like, oh, like I'm a teacher, like whether it's high school or grade school or whatever the case may be, it's always the oh, thank you for your service almost, and like we teachers don't get paid enough and stuff like this, and not that it's ever about pay because that's not why we came into this profession, but it's a lot of just dealing with recognition of the effort that we put into the like other children that are not ours. I'm not a father, but I hope to be someday, and I know how much I'm gonna like dedicate to my own child. But then when I look and see what we're contributing to a lot of these other people's children, I respond really well or really bad based off of like parent interaction. And I know that's never like the popular thing for teachers because I know a lot of my coworkers are like deathly afraid of like parent teacher conferences because there's always at least one or two parents coming in and saying like, you're doing a terrible job. Um, but I respond so well with like parent encouragement that, one of the worst experiences I've had teaching so far is one of those parent teacher conferences. And a parent came in talking about how like I should be fired because, of what I was doing, how I was doing my job. And she was like, if I was doing my job how you're doing yours, I would have been fired yesterday. And to give you the backstory of that is this: all I was doing was holding your student accountable. They were a senior in the class and they didn't turn in any assignments. Like they were literally just like your normal like ghost student. They may be there like physically in the chair, but just had no desire, and they were on track to fail their senior year and had to do some kind of credit recovery in the summer and like really mess with their like summer plans. And I mean, this parent came in all like hot and bothered, and she just was really like in my grill, and it was like really unpleasant because I don't know how you all do your parent teacher conferences. We normally do them in our classroom, for some reason, this one time, and of course it was this one time where like it was like in the cafeteria, just so to make it easier for the parents to like travel around to the different teachers. So I'm being like verbally berated by a parent in front of all these other families and like the other teachers. I was like, that was a really, really low moment for my teaching career on that. So, and I don't have any to say like more, I guess, in classroom struggles. I mean, there's always the struggles of just like getting like student buy-in. But I think that I do have one. I would say student apathy. That's one that I have just really, really struggled with all of the years of teaching. And I don't necessarily know if it's gotten better, gotten worse, about the same, but just having those students where it's just no matter what you do your whole show and dance in the front of the class, and you bring up every topic you can think of that might interest them, and it's just nothing. Because like a lot of these students, and it's like I'm never mad at the student. It's like I want what's best for them. I want them to have some kind of drive or a desire to do something in life. And there's just a lot of kids out there who are just like just apathetic towards everything, and it's really a tough thing for me to deal with because, like I said, I deal with a lot of those connections, and I thrive off of like, okay, if I'm bringing energy, like I want energy like returned back to me. And if I'm not getting that, it just kind of feels like it's a black hole, and it's just like never ending, and it's like now I'm just draining myself. And typically those are the days where like I'm like dragging like my knuckles like out of the building, and I sit in my car for an hour or so.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I mean, I haven't had a parent situation like that before. I've had like parents that were initially angry over emails, and then when I would explain like my side of what would happen to them, very detailed, they usually come back and quite understanding. I've had some friends of mine that have taught before. I had similar situations to what you had, where it was mostly over the phone, like getting like scolded by a parent. And I feel like a lot of times the consistency is it comes from a parent that I don't know if they have a lot of accountability at home. Like they hold it very accountable. So then it makes sense why the student isn't really being accountable as well. It's like, well, if it's not coming from home, it's not there. And it doesn't sound like you were being unreasonable, like unreasonably like required on them. Now that setting you were in, that's also just embarrassing as a professional too. Like you're in front of these families and your colleagues, and something like that happens. Something like that should not happen. It's kind of like the people that yell at waiters and waitresses. I'm like, how do you think that that's okay? Like, do you think that we would walk into your job and talk to you like that? But because we serve a public service and your tax money goes into that, I feel like justified in like tearing you down in front of like an audience or something like that. I have to admit too, Nelson, and I don't know if this is just indicative on the culture like now. The last 5 years or so, I would say that's my biggest issue too, is the apathy. Is just the last couple of years. I mean, I don't really have major behavior problems. It's not. It's just that there's always one or two students that's, like you said earlier, in their mind, I'm not going to cause problems in your classroom, but I'm not going to do anything. Like I'm not going to engage. I'm just going to kind of sit there. I'd rather just be like a shadow, and I want to care about them a lot. Like I want to keep working with them and keep pushing them and to do well. Because for me, what's sad, especially you teaching juniors, is that to me, I wonder either it's a home thing or it's a school thing over time, and maybe it's a little bit of both. But let's just say if that kid had a very poor educational experience their whole life, then how are they going to be when they get to you as a junior or me as a sophomore? Is that some of them have already made up in their mind by then, school's just not for me. I don't want any part of this. I'm just trying to get to 18 or something like that. And then me and you and others, we're trying really hard to spend the whole year trying to exhaust yourself on fighting it. And who knows? And maybe some of them just don't realize it until they're already graduated and they're gone for a while. I've had students that were kind of like that. You know, and
Hmm.
5 or 10 years later, they'll message you like, "Hey, I know you cared a lot about me. I know I wasn't a very good student. I just wanted you to know, like, I do know that you cared about me. Like, whenever you had it." So I will say,
Yeah.
when you've been teaching a little longer, because you're not a new teacher, but you're still in your fifth year, and you probably haven't had a ton of that yet, where a former student has reached out that's like a little bit older, but you'll be surprised at how many reach out to you when you get older. My oldest students now are 30 that I had originally, and I still hear from a lot of them. But thank you for sharing those. I mean, those trials
Yeah, of
that you have,
course.
because I do think that there's some anxiety with parent teacher conferences. Um, but I think that's good to bring on. If you're okay with it, I'd like to just ask you a couple more questions tonight.
Absolutely.
This one's going to be personal, so I don't know if you're going to have to kind of speak for your wife here. I don't know how she feels about this kind of thing. I have this theory that I think it makes sense why sometimes teachers marry other teachers, because at least they understand the lifestyle, the
Hmm.
demand of it, and whatnot. And maybe you don't have that kind of fortunate kind of thing on there, but I think it's important for teachers that are starting out, that are getting married or having families, having kids, is how do you in your first 5 years find the work life balance, especially when you're teaching a very demanding AP class. Do you feel like you've been able to do that relatively successful? Basically, when you have a spouse or a girlfriend or boyfriend, what's really needed of them when you have a career where you're a teacher? What do you think your significant other has to understand? And you as well. And I don't want to put it just on them. I
Sure.
guess in a way, what do both of you have to do as a compromise to really get through that year in and year out?
I mean, I think as a couple, and I mean, this is also just, I think, general good couple advice, but flexibility.
Yeah,
I think if, neither individual is willing to bend to like their way or something like that, then
yeah,
it's gonna be tough. It's gonna be tough to deal
mhm,
with. Um, I'm very fortunate. I have a very loving wife, and she's also, um, very aware of like my needs as a teacher, as just as her husband. So we have a really good partnership with that. Um, and one thing, and it took me about 2 years to get used to this, but one thing that I made a hard line stance on, now that once I got engaged, and now that I'm married, and looking to the future when I start having kids, is that I have to know when to turn the switch off. So,
mhm,
like for example, like just coming home from school that day is just that I've made a deal with myself and my wife that like when I'm leaving the school building, I'm done for the day for school. Like, and I
mhm.
really push for like whether it be admin to leave my planning periods alone. But I try to get my work done at work. And does that mean that like it takes maybe an extra week for some grades to get back to the kids? Maybe. But to me, the time spent at home with your family or with your significant other, your partner, whoever, is so much more important than that one grade getting turned in.
Yeah,
Because again, like not to like again like kind of talk about just the salary thing, because the salary thing is always going to be what it
yeah,
is. Um, but we're already kind of sacrificing a lot in this job. We shouldn't have to
yeah,
sacrifice our home lives too.
yeah.
So
That's true.
that's a hard stance that I've had to take, and it was tough. Again, like that first year when I was teaching, and I was just scrambling for resources and just trying to get things under my belt and have experiences. It was really tough to do that. But now that I'm in the position I am, closing the door on the day for school is something I have to do.
Have
Um,
you been able to do it pretty well?
I think so. I mean, granted, I will admit there are a few times where there are like more pressing things that I need to like take care of, like due dates, and especially now being PLC lead, I'm interested to see how the rest of this year is going to go for me, because they love to throw like extra assignments and things for me to do just because they think I'm getting bored, I guess.
Yeah,
So it's going to be a little bit tougher this year, but I think overall I've been pretty successful in it. I'm still able to perform my job exactly how I need to do it. My classes are still successful, and you know, like I said, it may take a little bit longer grading wise, but it does so much more for you and your own mental health. Um, And I always use the phrase for anybody like in a job that's kind of like this is that you can't pour from an empty bucket. So if your
Yeah.
bucket's always empty and you're always giving, 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 you're gonna run out. You're not gonna have anything else to give. So you gotta make sure your bucket's filled a little bit before you start pouring out.
Yeah. You sound like Adam Webster there because he said that almost identical thing with me when I was going through my divorce and I was married to someone who wasn't a teacher. I'll never forget one of the things he told me is it's hard whenever you empty. He would say cup when you empty your cup during the day and you catch yourself not having anything left when you get home. And
Yeah,
there's not like that. And I know he's had the same philosophy these last few years. Is like trying really hard to leave things at school, and I respect that. Do you mind if I ask you a follow up on that? Because you said the
sure.
first couple of years were a little challenging. A lot of our listeners might be new teachers, especially teaching an AP class. And me and you both had to do it too. We had to go look up and kind of relearn some stuff and learn that. Did you ever have those nights where you had some late nights, like trying to prep a lesson, trying to do some knowledge? Did you also go through that growing pains your first year or two from time to
Absolutely.
time?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think it's one of those. It's almost kind of like a non-negotiable that first year.
Yeah. I
Like
feel it.
I mean, you're already kind of getting put through the whirlwind as is.
Mhm.
Uh, but again, another piece of advice during that first year is just that like the beg, borrow, steal any material that you can find
Yeah.
because the less prep that you have to make yourself, and it's just something that you can go to. You have something ready for that next day. Finding this, even if it's teacher pay teachers, like I don't look down on resources like that because
Mhm.
why would you? I mean, they're resources.
Yeah.
Um, if you get like with some schools, they even offer you like free passes. Like the school like pays for like a certain number of passes that you can use on teacher pay teacher. But see if there's opportunities for that. But yeah, I mean, it is going to be a tough balance, and there will be those nights. But it's kind of that part of the first year, I think.
Mhm. Well, hey, another thing is the teachers pay teachers is great, and I want people to know I'm not a sponsor or anything for this, and I didn't do it until this spring, so I have yet to use it yet. But you and I are both fans of Steve Heimer's videos, and I'm telling you, like if you're a new teacher, it's worth the $30. Like I went on
Oh,
and I
his review
purchased
packet.
finally his review packet for
Yeah.
US or world or Euro, so I purchased that, and I have to admit, I really wish I would have done that 4 or 5 years ago if it would have been available. I don't know if it was available at that point, but if you're a new teacher, not only do you have like resources and practice questions and stuff like that for each unit, but you also have a mock exam. Like
Hmm.
you have a mock exam, full one made for you to do at your classes. You're not doing what I was trying to do. You're not trying to make your own mock exam from
Yeah.
scratch. Or using the one from the AP College Board website,
Well,
but I have to admit, if again, if it, for $29.99, I mean, that's a hell of a deal when you're first teaching the
absolutely.
class. And now I want to use it supplementally. But man, at the beginning, if you're just now entering AP now, this is a perfect time to follow someone like him. Another great resource that has great review packets is Emily Poole. I know she's more
Hmm.
known for TikTok and a little bit of YouTube. I'm going to have her on a future episode pretty soon too. But she's a very popular history teaching TikToker, and she also has her own review ones. I haven't seen those, but I really think that her and Heimer might be both really, really good resources to use. It's not that the crash courses. I think I was more from the generation of the John Green like crash
Yeah.
course generation, and those are still valuable. But the great thing about Heimer's stuff that he's remade over the last couple of years, it goes perfectly with our course guide, right?
Yep.
I mean, he's following it perfectly, and he's hitting those skills. And they're only like 7 to 10 minute long videos. I mean, it's not just that the students should watch them; you as the teacher should watch
Oh,
it because he
absolutely.
he
Yeah.
emotionally and he passionately and he uses a lot of humor. He makes it like entertaining to do that, and I highly recommend it. There's no shame in
No.
watching a student Heimler video for you as the teacher. I don't think there's any shame in
Absolutely
that
not.
at
No.
all. And
I mean, there's even like another resource I was just thinking about specifically for like APUS. It's called the Bill
mhm,
of Rights Institute. They
mhm.
used to
I've heard
have
of
like
that.
their own version of the textbooks, but now like they have done similar things, breaking up unit by unit for the APUSH exam. Um, and even at the bare minimum, you already mentioned it, but like really leaning on like the AP Central and the College Board stuff. I mean, they are the people who make these exams. They this is straight from the horse's mouth, like this material. It's really, if you follow that, even if you like, because there are daily videos and topic questions that they always have. If you're
Yeah.
watching the daily videos and you're taking notes on those, and then you give them out to the kids, I think that's perfectly fine. It's aligning perfectly with the people who
Hmm.
give this exam. So you can't get
Yeah.
any more accurate than that. And it's so easy, and it really does have a planned out for you. So
Yeah. Hey, that's great. So, hey, I got one more question for you, and we'll wrap this up tonight for our
okay,
first episode together. I think it's really good to end on a positive note. I know I asked you about your obstacles and a couple of those more difficult memories that you had to go through or experiences. Let's end on our positive one. So, looking back on your career so far, what's one moment, or more than one if you want to share it, that, or if you have a student success story that reminds you of why you chose the path as a teacher?
oof. I mean, that's always a tough question. I think part of, like, again, what I go into teaching for is to make more worldly students. Um, I always think of like part of our mission statement at Holy Cross is to make lifelong learners, and I dive into that like full. So like whenever I hear any student that's like either majoring in history and like on their way to become a teacher, like I've had one student so far say that they're going to be a history teacher, and part of it was from like how my classes were. So to me, that one like hit really close to home, just because of like my own story of like why I became a teacher is because of my high school teacher. So that was a really kind of tearjerker moment for me. Another one, and it's a little more fun. It's not so much as like, super like tearjerker, but like, um, you know, the summer trip that I had, and again, part of like that experiences of having lifelong learners and they're, worldly students. I had a student who honestly was pretty quiet when I had her in my classes. Didn't really do much. I want to say she didn't do much, but she was not the most vocal student. She's not volunteering herself. Like, she was quiet to the back. She did her
Mhm.
work. It was just fine. On that trip, I saw her just like turn into a whole different person. Like, she got it. We were touring around Ireland, and she's talked to me more in Ireland than she ever did throughout the entire school year that I had her. Um, and I mean, it just was like watching a completely different person. And she comes up to me at the end of the trip and thanked me for, planning this trip. And she's like, "This is the best experience that I've ever had in my life. And I don't think I would have done it if you were like not the one that's leading this trip." So that was a really kind of special moment too. And it was a really fun thing. It's, we learned a lot of stuff while we were over there. Like, we, got a full grasp of these cultures and people. So, but to have something experience like that, and to me, that's why we're going back. It's not because
Mhm.
we're teaching like the gold and silver standard, like I was talking about earlier. Like,
Yeah.
we're not hoping that, like, well, maybe we hope that our students will remember it, but we don't expect them to, right? It's like part of
Mhm.
like the lessons, the life learning that comes out of this stuff. So
Yeah.
yeah, those
I'm
are my
with you,
two
and
favorites.
nothing replaces that experience. Like, as much as you probably liked your class, whether she was quiet or not, she'll never forget that trip
No.
to like Ireland, all that. Like that, an experience like that. I don't know how anybody does that and doesn't change a little bit. Like, obviously your perspectives and your knowledge is going to change, and you got to see a whole nother side of her. That had to be a really rewarding experience to have. My only thing that it doesn't involve as cool as going to Ireland, but I've had that one student before where she was really quiet in class, wouldn't engage out loud, but actually a pretty good writer for a sophomore. And
Mhm.
she always kind of had that look, like her resting face was like, "I'm judging you." So it's always
Yeah,
the quiet students that I can never tell if they
absolutely.
like me as a teacher or not. And I'll never forget that she had told another teacher friend of mine the other day, whenever they asked her about classes that she took, and she said that she took AP Euro, and she said the funniest thing. She said, my friend said, "Well, what did you think of the class? What did you think of Mr. Malcolmson?" And she said, "I loved Malcolmson as a teacher. I hated the class. Like, I hated the subject."
Yeah, there's
But
always
it's
those.
one of those things where it's like, "Hey, I get it. The subject's not for everybody." But to me, it's like it's not just the ones that are outspoken, but to get those quiet students that they're trying, they're not as involved. But if they come and say, "Hey, something you did really stuck with me. You really like inspired me on that." It's like, how often do you really hear that from a quiet student? Like because they leave your class and you sometimes never really know how they felt about you or the class. And every once in a while you'll hear that from them. And sometimes it may not be another 2 or 5 or 10 years until after they're already gone. And you check on them on social media and just ask them how life is going. And you'd be surprised at how much they remember. They don't remember your content, but they remember like certain activities, or they remember your personality. And that means the most to me. Is like sometimes that's what keeps me teaching, is that, there's always the controversial stuff that we're always going to be dealing with that we wish would be better on that. But it seems like whenever I'm at my lowest point, something like that will happen. Some message will come in unsolicited. Something like that will come in and just like remind me again of why I'm doing this. Like I have a lunchbox in my room. I mean, packed to the brim over the last 15 years, from the time my student taught to now, of just goodbye letters and cards. So when I have those low days, sometimes I'll just open it up and I'll take a few out and just read it to remind me of, like, I can be a good teacher. Like I can do this, because on those days where you're dealing with the student that's apathetic, and no matter what you're trying, you really want to work, like, to connect with them on there. Sometimes you start to second guess your skill and your approach. Like, am I really a good teacher anymore? Am I able to do this anymore? I think there's a lot of that self-conscious things. But Nelson, I've kept you for too long tonight. I'm sure your wife is like, where's he at? I appreciate you doing an hour and a half. I know we didn't do a full Joe Rogan 3 or 4 hour conversation here, but I guess we'll leave that for our first ever history topic. I hope that you're willing to come back again.
Absolutely.
I think you said this is your first time doing a podcast, so I hope you enjoyed it. It was a good first one on that. And other than that, is there any last little words that you want to leave to, if there is a new teacher in here, or even experienced one, is there anything that you want to kind of leave them as kind of a last statement tonight?
Yeah, I think, and this kind of goes in vain even with our last question, talking about, like, connecting with those students, is that the students look up to you as a role model a lot more than you think that they do. And you never truly know, like, just a student's home life. So any moment you have to, like, connect with a student, definitely take it, because that student will sometimes, maybe, be more involved in your class. But it's the part of, like, building that connection and that relationship, and having that fundamental trust between you and the student is so important. I think I will probably change my answer from way before, but I will probably put student relationships probably at the top of my list, because without student relationships, everything else we've been talking about can't happen. So I definitely think
and again, I think that you and I have had that experience with, probably, obviously no names, but we've had that experience for teachers that we've had in school, or that we taught with, where content wise they're masterful. Like they know their subject extremely well. They're skilled. They're even really good at creating ideas and assignments, but they have no idea how to empathize with a teenager. They have no idea how to connect with them, or they do know and they're just refusing to understand it. But that's one of those things that I think that's kind of heartbreaking sometimes as teachers, that sometimes when you get out of undergrad, you come out thinking that content is going to be your most important concern. And to be honest with you, you said it, it's relationships 100%. If buy-in is your number one concern, then you need to prioritize relationships first. And sometimes it takes time. I will admit, like, I'll share this later. Nelson, I've shown you this before, I think, when you were student teaching. I always start off every school year, those first 3 days, with a live test. I don't ask them any questions about history. Here's a packet of about 30 questions that's just about your life. They're like deeper philosophical things. And then I read them over the course of the year, and I know what they like and what they don't like and what they've gone through in their life. And I try to connect with them through that, and then I give that back to them their senior year to see how they felt about their life. But I feel like as a teacher, I mean, you got to do something along the way. It's okay some days to take the beginning of class, some days to not even necessarily do a content thing, but have a bell ringer question that's just about life, something kind of goofy or funny. It's okay. I don't know if you saw Steve Heimler's video of, I saw it for the first time last week, but it's an older video. He says, I think he said, the moment when I realized, I think he said I was a good teacher, or like bad teacher, something like that.
Yeah.
Have you seen it?
Yeah.
We're basically,
like I failed or something like that.
Yeah, I failed. Yes. Because he said he is so scrambled and busy trying to plan that he taught the same lesson on accident 2 days in a row, and the kids kind of called him out on that, and I asked him. So he didn't really know what to do. So in that moment, he just asked his students, like he had the humility to just stop and go, "Hey, what do you guys want to talk about today? We have an hour here."
Yeah.
And he just let the students ask him questions about life. And he had a girl leaving class tell him, "This was the best day of class I've ever had." And that just shows you right there, students are starving for a chance to have their voices heard. And that's why I do so much philosophy in class and whatnot. We do seminars because I'm like, even if they don't want to do it sometimes, how often do they really get to do that? How often do they really get to sit, look at each other and me face to face on eye level? Because, I'm not going to be 6'8" towering over them. I want to sit with them in a group and just give them a chance to do that content, but to bring in their own opinion with it. I just feel like once you can get them used to that, it goes so much better. At least in my personal experience, it's gone a lot better. But it is a little bit of a rocky road. Like, as you know, relationships rarely just go like that, like super quick. It could take you a whole 9 weeks or sometimes even a semester to break those walls down. And in some cases, sadly, maybe the whole year, maybe not ever in that year. But I don't think that we can stop trying. I think that we have to continue to keep doing that. But Nelson, thank you again for your time. Your time is extremely important and valuable. And I hope that you get a good time. And I hope that you're willing to come back.
Absolutely. I'll be eagerly awaiting the next invite.
Thank you, man. All right. So as always, I hope that all of you have a great night and a great rest of your week, and be contagious.